The final transmission from Voyager 2 came in at 3:17 UTC, a thin whisper of static rolling across the deep space network like a dying breath. At first, the operators assumed it was background noise, one of the countless distortions that came from working with a spacecraft nearly half a century old. But then the signal stuttered, elongated, and broke into a pattern no one had ever seen. Inside the control room, heads lifted at once, fingers froze over keyboards. The world, though unaware, was already changing. The heartbeat rhythm telemetry that Voyager 2 had faithfully delivered since 1977 wavered like something was pressing against it. Something outside the craft, or inside the data stream itself. One operator leaned in toward his monitor, eyes narrowing as a flicker ran across his display. He recognized the waveforms, or rather, he recognized what they should have been. But these weren't right. These were layered, interlaced with frequencies that had no business existing in the vacuum beyond the heliopause. Someone muttered that it had to be solar interference. Another suggested the spacecraft's transmitter had finally begun to degrade after decades in deep space. But the senior engineer on shift shook her head. Her pulse raced. She had seen anomalies before, random packet corruption, cosmic ray hits, bits flipping at random. But this wasn't random. This was structured, organized, deliberate. The room shifted from casual concern to full alert as the final packet arrived, larger than anything Voyager 2 should have been capable of generating. It hit the servers like a stone dropped into still water, overwhelming the buffer, spilling fragments across diagnostic screens. A warning tone blared through the room. Every operator turned toward the main display as the waveform flattened, plateaued, and then plunged into complete, irreversible silence. Within minutes, calls were placed to Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA headquarters, and the Deep Space Network's global partners. Someone locked the doors to the control room. Someone else pulled the recording buffer offline before the automated archiving system could distribute it worldwide. The room remained silent except for the hum of machines and the whisper of static still echoing from the servers. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The only thought on everyone's mind hung unspoken. Voyager 2 didn't die. It was stopped. Beyond the edge of the solar system, the spacecraft floated in darkness, farther from the sun than any human-made object except its sibling, Voyager 1. For decades, it had crossed the interstellar boundary, sending back faint but steady telemetry. Yet even with its age and limitations, Voyager 2 had never behaved like this. Space was quiet. Space was predictable. Space did not reach out and shut down a probe. Inside the JPL main briefing room, researchers from multiple departments crowded around the big wall display as the last recorded signal played in slow motion. The waveform pulsed with strange geometric distortions, like a three-dimensional shape being folded into a two-dimensional stream. Someone pointed out repeating peaks. Someone else suggested they were too symmetrical to be random. It looked like a signature, a message, an imprint of something that had touched the spacecraft. The director of the Voyager project leaned forward and asked if the distortion came from Voyager's failing systems, but the radio engineers shook their heads in unison. The frequencies present in the final transmission were far beyond the craft's hardware capability. Something external had modified them, something vastly more powerful. One analyst overlaid the distortions into a simulated 3D model. The room went silent as a geometric shape unfolded on the screen, rotating slowly. It wasn't a natural structure. It wasn't even reminiscent of any mathematical noise pattern. It was a near-perfect icosahedron inscribed with smaller recursive shapes, each spinning inside the next. It resembled something found once before, in a place buried beneath the Iraqi desert. Something too old and too precise to belong to human hands. As soon as that comparison was made aloud, the room fell into a deeper, heavier silence. Not everyone knew the reference. Only those with the highest clearance had seen the recovered object, the one unearthed in a tomb so ancient it defied human timelines. And yet here it was, appearing again, this time in a signal from beyond the boundary of the solar system. While NASA's top minds struggled to parse the data, news of Voyager 2's sudden silence leaked to the press. First, through a cryptic tweet from an enthusiastic amateur astronomer in Australia, then from a worker at the Canberra Deep Space Antenna, who posted a blurry screenshot of the flatlined waveform. Within hours, hashtags surged across the internet. Conspiracy theories ignited. News stations ran emergency banners. Every headline asked the same question: what stopped Voyager 2? Inside the White House Situation Room, a classified emergency briefing was held. NASA officials explained what they could, which wasn't much. They didn't understand the signal. They couldn't replicate it. They couldn't locate its source. It came through Voyager 2, but not from Voyager 2. Something had used the probe as a relay, a lens, or a doorway. The president listened in silence, tapping 2 fingers against the table, then asked the question no one wanted to answer. Did something make contact with us? No one spoke. That silence was an answer by itself. Across the world, the European Space Agency, China's CNSA, and several private space companies requested access to the classified signal. NASA refused. China demanded transparency. The ESA pleaded for cooperation. The US government hesitated. The signal wasn't just data. It was a pattern. It was a map. It was an artifact. And it was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. Inside a secure facility at JPL, cryptographers, astrophysicists, and mathematicians worked around the clock. They discovered that the final packet from Voyager 2 wasn't a single message, but multiple layers encoded within one another. When decoded through Fourier analysis, the icosahedral shape revealed gravitational lensing diagrams. When analyzed through pattern recursion, it revealed something resembling coordinates. Not coordinates in normal space, but coordinates positioned and calibrated to account for stellar drift over tens of thousands of years. Where the coordinates pointed was even more disturbing. The location was far outside the solar system, beyond any cataloged star or object. It was a region of space so empty, so barren, it was considered a cosmic dead zone. Yet something had used Voyager 2 to point directly at it. As scientists wrestled with the implications, a discovery emerged. After Voyager 2's shutdown, the Deep Space Network detected a faint echo, a reflection of the final signal bouncing back. But the echo didn't match the outbound pattern. It was modified. Something had responded. Something had answered. The echo was traced to a point just outside the heliopause, the boundary where the sun's influence fades and interstellar space begins. But it wasn't a spacecraft. It wasn't debris. It wasn't anything physical that could be tracked. It was a distortion, a ripple in space-time itself, like the solar system had been brushed by an unseen hand. Back on Earth, panic and fascination spread in equal measure. News channels ran endless loops of Voyager documentaries. Religious leaders called it a sign. Physicists called it impossible. Governments called it classified. And for the first time in decades, humanity as a whole stared outward again with the same mixture of hope and dread that had defined the earliest days of the space age. Then a NASA memo was leaked, an internal document marked for Level 6 clearance only. It stated bluntly that the final transmission from Voyager 2 exhibited signs of non-human intentionality. The internet erupted. Protests formed outside NASA centers. Some demanded disclosure. Others begged them to shut down all deep space communication systems. Inside JPL, tension fractured into open conflict. Some researchers argued that the signal should be shared with the world. Others insisted it must remain classified to prevent panic. Others still believed the signal wasn't a warning or a greeting, but a test, a probe from something waiting beyond the void. Meanwhile, anomalies continued to emerge. The James Webb Space Telescope was redirected to scan the heliopause region. What it found wasn't a solid object, but a thin, moving shimmer, as if light itself was bending around something unseen. The observation lasted only minutes before the shimmer vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a faint trace of infrared energy. The decoding team made another breakthrough. The geometric structure found in the signal matched one discovered decades earlier beneath the sands of Iraq. The artifact connected to legends of the Anunnaki and the tomb attributed to Gilgamesh. The similarity was undeniable. The same ratios, the same recursive geometry, the same impossible precision. If the ancient artifact and the Voyager 2 signal came from the same source, then the conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever had touched the spacecraft had also touched Earth long before recorded history. Fear spread through the highest levels of government. What did it mean? Were these two events part of a larger pattern? Had humanity been observed, visited, or cataloged before? And if so, why reveal themselves now at the edge of the solar system, using a dying probe humans had almost forgotten? The analysis continued relentlessly. Another layer of the signal revealed something even more alarming, a pulse pattern that resembled a scanning sequence, as if Voyager 2 had been examined, measured, and then shut off deliberately. It wasn't an attack, it was an evaluation. And then came the power signature, an incredibly brief burst of energy detected by multiple DSN antennas, one that didn't originate from the spacecraft itself. It was external, strong enough to overpower Voyager 2's transmitter and imprint its own pattern into the final signal, yet it left no detectable trace afterward. The verdict was clear. Something had directly interacted with the probe. As the world spiraled with speculation, a final revelation shook the scientific community. When the last segment of the final packet was decoded, it revealed a shape, one that rotated, shifted, and eventually unfolded into what looked unmistakably like a doorway or portal. It wasn't literal but symbolic, a representation of a boundary between spaces, with Voyager 2 positioned right at the threshold. The meaning was uncertain. Was it an invitation, a warning, a demonstration, or something else entirely? The global space agencies reconvened in secret. Politicians demanded answers. Scientists demanded time. But time was running out. The Deep Space Network detected a second anomaly, this one not coming from Voyager 2's location, but aimed directly at Earth from interstellar space. This signal was stronger, clearer, more focused. It wasn't routed through any spacecraft. It wasn't bounced off any object. It had no origin point that human instruments could triangulate. It was simply there, appearing inside Earth's receivers, as though it had always existed. The world held its breath as the signal was decoded live. It carried no words, no images, no coordinates. It carried the same rotating icosahedral structure found beneath the Iraqi sands and within Voyager 2's final transmission. It wasn't a message. It was a mark, a claim. The signal intensified, pulsing slowly, almost like a heartbeat, as if something immeasurably vast had just turned its attention toward Earth after waiting in silence for longer than civilization had existed. Everything humanity thought it understood about its place in the universe shifted in an instant. Voyager 2 had not gone silent. It had been silenced, and whatever had done it was now speaking directly to us. The world waited for what would come next. But no one, not NASA, not governments, not the brilliant minds decoding the impossible, could prepare for the realization that humanity had never been alone. We just hadn't been interesting. Until now. And as the signal pulsed one final time, its shape collapsing inward before disappearing altogether, every receiver on Earth lit up simultaneously with a new transmission, one with a pattern no human technology had ever produced, a pattern shaped unmistakably, like an answer. And the world understood, in cold silence, that Voyager 2's final transmission had not stopped the world by accident. It was only the beginning. The answer did not arrive as a coherent stream. It appeared instead as a cascade of pulses, each separated by impossible intervals, as though the transmission were folding space around itself. The Deep Space Network's receivers overloaded instantly, kicking into emergency buffering just to stay online. Engineers stared at the rising heat on their consoles, watching their systems push past safe limits. But no one dared shut anything down. Not now, not when the signal was finally speaking back. The pulses formed shapes that flickered between dimensions, patterns that compressed and expanded like breathing. Software attempted to translate them into audio, then into visual formats, then into mathematical matrices. Every method failed. The signal wasn't meant for interpretation by machines. It bypassed algorithms entirely, as if addressing something deeper, something the human mind recognized before it could understand. Inside JPL, a veteran astrophysicist rubbed her temples as the patterns washed across the wall display. She whispered that it felt familiar, like a memory she never lived. A young intern beside her nodded, his pulse racing. He said he felt like the shapes were trying to teach him something, pressing against his thoughts like the first words of a forgotten language. Then the pulse sequence changed. It slowed, it deepened, it stabilized, and suddenly, every screen in the room displayed the same image. The outline of Voyager 2. Not a photograph, not a diagram. A perfect rendering, cleaner and more precise than anything human-made. The craft rotated in silence, each component drawn with microscopic accuracy. Even the scratches on its golden record cover were visible. The room fell still. The rendering zoomed inward. It passed through Voyager 2's exterior plating, revealing internal circuits, thermal pockets, residual radiation patterns. It was as if the signal were replaying its own inspection, its dissection of the craft before shutting it down. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone asked if the transmission was trying to show what it had done. Someone else wondered if it was explaining itself. But the senior engineer standing near the front of the room clenched her jaw. She recognized what she was seeing. It wasn't an explanation, it was proof. The rendering froze at the probe's transmitter assembly. A geometric symbol, the same recursive icosahedron, appeared beside it. Lines connected the symbol to the transmitter, indicating the exact moment where the external force had overridden Voyager 2's systems. The symbol flickered, And then the image shifted. It no longer showed the spacecraft. It showed the solar system. At first glance, it was a simple map, one NASA had generated countless times. But then a new object appeared on the outskirts, beyond the heliopause. It was faint, barely visible, like a smudge of darkness superimposed over the background of interstellar space. The smudge pulsed. The solar system map zoomed outward. The smudge grew. It had a shape. Not a planet, not a vessel, not anything human science could classify. It resembled a void, a hollow, shifting absence that bent light around its edges, a gravitational well with no mass, a scar in space-time itself. Someone gasped. Someone else backed away from the screen. The object pulsed again. And then, without warning, it moved. Across the projection, the anomaly shifted position rapidly, crossing distances that should have taken centuries. It appeared closer, then closer still. Every jump made the room feel smaller, the air heavier, like the anomaly's motion was not just visual but physical, pressing against reality. When it stopped, it hovered just beyond the orbit of Neptune. The room fell silent. No one breathed. The image destabilized. The edges pixelated. The anomaly flickered. The signal strained against its own intensity, the pulses growing irregular, frantic. Then, the rendering disappeared. The screens went black for 3 long seconds that felt like minutes. A single line of text appeared. Not yet. The words were not English. They were not written, typed, or encoded. They appeared fully formed, as though imprinted onto the screens by an intelligence that didn't need language. The phrase resonated inside the minds of everyone present, vibrating against their thoughts with a clarity more intimate than hearing. Some staggered back. A few collapsed into chairs. One scientist began crying softly, overwhelmed by a message that felt ancient, cold, and absolute. Before anyone could process the words, the screens lit up again. This time, the image did not show Voyager 2 or the solar system. It showed Earth. Not a satellite rendering, not a NASA image, a perspective from deep space, as if viewed through the eyes of something observing from far beyond the planets. Earth glowed faintly, wrapped in thin bands of blue and white. Beautiful, fragile, alone. A new shape appeared around Earth. An outline, faint at first, then clearer. A globe, a shell, a cage. It closed slowly, like a metal iris. The cold realization rippled across the room. If that representation was accurate, it wasn't showing what was. It was showing what would be. The pulse sequence intensified. The lights dimmed. Static rose from the speakers like distant thunder. Deep beneath the signal, something rumbled. Something vast, patient, and older than the language the pulse had just carved into human minds. And then the transmission cut out. Every monitor went dark. The lights snapped back on. The room sat in stunned silence. Before anyone could react, an alarm began blaring from the Deep Space Network's console. A red warning flashed across the nearest screen. New signal detected. Source, unknown. Vector, inbound. Someone whispered that the first message wasn't the answer. It was the introduction. The inbound signature grew stronger, rising with a tempo like a heartbeat reverberating through the Earth's magnetic field. The frequency was no longer distant, no longer delicate, no longer filtered through an aging spacecraft. It was direct, growing, approaching. Someone asked if they were about to witness contact. Someone else whispered that contact wasn't the right word, that this felt more like being noticed. The intensity climbed. Data overflowed the receivers. The nearest antenna array began to heat, metal expanding. Technicians shouted about overload, shutting down subsystems to prevent fire. But the signal didn't care. It forced itself through every available channel, hijacking the equipment like a mind reaching through a body. The wall screens flickered back on. The recursive icosahedron returned. This time it spun faster, and faster, and faster still. The edges became streaks of light. The recursion deepened, unfolding into dimensions no human eye could follow. The shapes stretched the limits of perception, bending the room, bending thought. For a moment, just one, everyone present felt an impossible sensation, a presence. Looking at them, through the symbol, through the signal, through the void itself, and then the shape froze. A single pulse struck the room like a silent shockwave. Every screen went white. Every receiver dropped offline. Every instrument flatlined. The signal was gone. But something else remained. A final fragment. One that slipped through the shutdown, embedded inside the last frame of data. It was small, almost insignificant. A tiny glyph at the bottom corner of the transmission. But the decoding team recognized it immediately. It was the same symbol found on the buried ancient artifact. The same symbol encoded in Voyager 2's last breath. The same symbol now aimed directly at Earth. A warning, a countdown, a claim, or a promise. No one knew which, but everyone understood one thing clearly. Whatever silenced Voyager 2 was no longer at the edge of the solar system. It was already here,